So the growing demand for a vote for women in late 19th century Europe eventually began to manifest itself in the emergence of organisations that were specifically dedicated towards achieving women's suffrage. And the three main countries where we see suffrage, the suffragette movement at its strongest were the United Kingdom, France, and Germany. So in Germany by 1900, there was about 850 organisations dedicated in one way or another towards demanding the vote for Germany. In France, going back to 1889, there had been a conference, an International Congress on Women's Rights, held in Paris, in which to try and organise a collective effort on the part of women to achieve votes in their own respective countries. Indeed, in France, in 1914, with the Socialist Party having such a large influence in the French Parliament, it seemed that the French government was about to pass the right for women to vote in 1914 until the First World War intervened. And then, as I mentioned earlier on, it really wasn't until the end of the Second World War that women actually got a vote in France. So it ultimately delayed women's vote in France almost 30 years. But perhaps the most obvious example of the suffragette movement, and certainly where it was at its strongest, was in the United Kingdom. Dating back to 1864, women had been given the right to vote in local city elections, but not in national elections. So when we talk about the women's suffrage movement in the United Kingdom, we're specifically talking about the demand of women to have a vote in national elections. In 1866, a petition signed by thousands of women was delivered to the House of Parliament, delivered by John Stuart Mill, who I mentioned earlier on, the famous liberal of the mid-19th century, demanding the vote for women. This was ignored by Parliament. Then again, the petition was re-delivered to Parliament in 1890, with 250,000 signatures from various men and women, mostly women, demanding the right to vote. So in Britain, we have the most organised, concentrated efforts to achieve suffrage for women compared to the rest of Europe. And we have a variety of organisations that emerged there to try and promote or advocate the cause of female voting. So the National Union of Women's Suffrage Societies was created by Millicent Fawcett in 1897. It rapidly grew, and by 1908, so within about a decade of its formation, it had 500,000 members. And there's an interesting difference split in the women's rights movement in the United Kingdom in the early 20th century. So Millicent Fawcett was from a middle-class background herself. The members of her union tended to be middle class, and she very much advocated responsible political activity, respectable political activity, so making speeches, writing newspaper articles, writing petitions to Parliament, all normal political activity within the sphere of democratic government, democratic society, in order to persuade people to accept, in terms of reason and rationality, the rights of women to vote. And her group, because a more militant form of feminism emerges around the same time, Fawcett's group were often known as the suffragists, as opposed to the suffragettes. The suffragettes were the more militant, more confrontational group who demanded women's rights. So Fawcett's middle-class suffragist movement was counterbalanced in many ways by the suffragettes, who were led by Emmeline Pankhurst. And they believed that it was much more important to directly challenge the injustice of women not being allowed to vote in national elections. So in 1903, Emmeline Pankhurst established the Women's Social and Political Union, the WSPU, and she very much believed that this isn't about just writing polite petitions and writing very well thought out articles. Nothing will change unless we essentially force men to accept change in that sense. So the suffragettes tend to be much more militant, and over the course of the first decade of the 20th century, they became more and more militant as time went on. That is to say, because their initial kind of large angry protests didn't really achieve much, they became more confrontational. They became willing to use arson, oftentimes setting fire to post boxes in particular. They began pouring acid on golf greens in various men's country clubs and various golf clubs. Many of these women were imprisoned for their activities, and as a result, many of them went on hunger strike. In fact, the tactic of hunger striking was invented by the women's suffragette movement in the United Kingdom, and essentially by going on hunger strike, initially forcing the authorities to release them, because the authorities didn't want them to die while they were in prison. Once that the authorities kind of realized that was exactly what the suffragettes wanted, to be released, and they began force feeding the women. Force feeding, if you're not aware, is actually a very brutal way of you essentially get a tube and stuff it down someone's throat and pump the food in. And it's very dangerous, because if the food goes down the windpipe as opposed to the esophagus, which it certainly can do if you're being force fed, it's possible to kill someone, and people did die being force fed during these strikes. One of the most famous or notorious examples of suffragette activism came in 1913, when the suffragettes detonated a bomb at the house of David Lloyd George, who was the British Chancellor for the Exchequer, essentially the British head of the Treasury, or Secretary of the Treasury, I guess, in American parlance. Now, Lloyd George was not in the house. No one was in the house at the time. That was why they picked the time when they detonated the bomb. But Emmeline Pankhurst, that they admitted responsibility for it, and was imprisoned for her role in that. So just to show you, these suffragettes were very, very willing to push the envelope in terms of achieving women's vote. The thing that kind of undermined the suffragette campaign ultimately was the outbreak of the First World War. That Pankhurst realised that it would be simply bad publicity for the movement to continue its hardline or its kind of confrontational tactics with war going on. So she and the Women's Social and Political Union stopped their militant activism. And at the end of the war, the government finally relented and granted women the vote. Although it's worth bearing in mind that in 1918, the law the British government introduced was that all men over 21 could vote, but women had to be over 30. And if you're wondering why that was, it was basically because of the slaughter of the First World War. They were afraid that if women aged 21 could vote, there would be more female than male voters, and they felt that wasn't right. Obviously, for their reasons at the time. It wasn't until 1928 that the voting age for women was lowered to 21 and made completely equal with men. Actually, that law was introduced a couple of weeks before Emmeline Pankhurst herself died. So I want to show you a video that just gives you some kind of flavour of the kind of confrontational nature of the suffragette movement, and also some of the violence they suffered as a result of their activities.
A May Day meeting in Victoria Park. Keep close and keep together. The police must allow us to enter the park.
Separate the leaders!
Get them into the enclosure behind the sheds!
Come on! Hold back!
Down the steps and behind the shed!
Don't let him go! No, God! Stop fighting! Don't resist!
We must unchain you. Where are the keys? The keys to the padlocks! Where are they?
Do you think we'd be so foolish as to bring them with us?
Break the padlocks! Truncheons!
Keep your filthy hands off of me!
Hold steady a bit, I'll break your wrist!
Oh, bastard! Bastard! Oh!
So the woman pictured here. So the woman pictured here is Emily Davison. Emily Davison was one of the most famous suffragettes in the early 20th century United Kingdom. She was actually a very well-educated woman. She had actually taken the final exams for English at Oxford University in 1895, where she received a grade of a first-class honours, which essentially was the equivalent of an A. Because Oxford, so basically the system was you could take the exams, but you could only be awarded the degree if you were a man. So she essentially earned the degree in terms of passing the exams. It was not awarded the degree. She joined Emmeline Pankhurst's Women's Political and Social Union, the Women's Social and Political Union in 1903, and was one of the most active, most militant members of the Women's Social and Political Union. She was imprisoned 4 times for her activities, her confrontational activities connected with the suffragette movement, and she was force-fed 49 times during her various imprisonments. And she described in her diaries of just what torture she felt being force-fed was. During one of these imprisonments, she actually attempted suicide. She threw herself down a 40-foot iron staircase, and she survived. I mean, she was very badly hurt, broke some vertebrae in her back, badly fractured her skull, but she afterwards explained that she was doing this because she believed that her suffering, her death, might help prevent the suffering of others. In particular, she was trying to draw attention to the barbaric nature of being force-fed while on hunger strike. And the reason I want to give that backstory because it offers some context as to what happened at the end of Davison's life. The most famous act for which her suffrage, or the most famous example of her suffragette activities, which was her decision in 1913 to travel to the Derby, the famous British horse race held at Epsom Downs every year. And she obviously wanted to engage in some kind of protest, although we're not exactly sure what she was trying to do. So let me just play the video here of Davison. So this is the picture of Davison, but it's going to take us to the racetrack in a moment. So this is the Derby horse race in 1913, and you will see Davison emerge. So she was a spectator. We'll see her. This is her basically being highlighted in yellow. And during the race, as we'll see in a moment, she decides to come out onto the racetrack, which was very, very dangerous. These horses obviously are large animals. They're traveling at 35 miles an hour. And the horse that she's standing in front of right now is the King's horse. And that's the horse that hit her. So she was knocked down. The horse obviously fell over. The jockey was thrown off. And Davison actually died as a result of her injuries. He died 2 days later, never recovered consciousness. And the big mystery is, what was she trying to do? What kind of obviously this was a suffragette protest of some kind. She had 2 suffragette banners on her. And the most commonly accepted theory is that she was trying to attach the banner to the horse. These are pictures from her funeral here. So 50,000 people attended Davison's funeral. Obviously for the suffragettes, she was an enormous hero. But and this is from the Suffragette magazine, Davison, who laid down her life for the suffragette cause. In wider society, she was condemned. King George V's wife, for example, is referred to as a horrid woman. A lot of people said she was a maniac, suicidal. And that's one of the questions. So again, we'll see her being hit here by the king. The horse she was actually hit by was the King's horse, Amner. Historians are not sure whether she knew it was the King's horse or whether it was just chance. We're really not sure. What was she trying to do? The most common theory is she was simply trying to attach one of these suffragette flags to the horse in order to make a statement, and she didn't realize just how dangerous it was to try and do that. Others suggest perhaps this was a suicide attempt. Obviously, as I mentioned, she had attempted suicide before, and she had really suffered very badly as a result of her suicide attempt and was in constant pain. So it's not implausible that this also might have been a suicide attempt in which she simultaneously was trying to draw attention to the suffragette cause. So Emily Davison dies in 1913. Women don't get a vote for another 5 years, but still to this day is obviously remembered as very much a heroic figure in the feminist movement in the United Kingdom.